Hey guys, thanks for clicking on the thumbnail for this wobbly chair repair video from Next Level Carpentry. In this video, I'll show you a surprisingly easy and effective way to stabilize loose joinery in old furniture like these two wobbly chairs. Chairs like these that are far too wobbly to be useful, but not wobbly enough that they can be taken apart without damage, sadly, often end up in a landfill because repairs cost so much more than replacement with newer but inferior chairs. I really wish I'd figured out how to stabilize loose joinery on old furniture like this decades ago, because it makes rescuing classic pieces like these old oak chairs both feasible and practical. As you'll see, unlike dozens of other videos on the topic here on YouTube, my method doesn't require any disassembly other than removing seat cushions, so you don't have to worry about breaking the very parts you're trying to stabilize during the repair process. I only recently started using this process, so I'm still learning some of the finer points of efficiency, but I hope the takeaway is that you can get excellent repair results even if this method is new to you too. Full disclosure? Yep, I'm already aware that just the intro to this video is longer than a YouTube short, so if you're already bored, there's no hard feelings if you click away to a more polished channel. But if you're ready for a deep dive into fixing wobbly old furniture, let's get to it. Alrighty then, I think I'll just start with this chair because it's got a bit less wobble than the other chair, so it's kind of like low-hanging fruit. And that's what I'd like to start off with, to cover some of the basics of fixing joints this way. And you'll get the gist of how this furniture repair works. And then towards the end of the video, I'll take on that chair and use some advanced clamping methods to make the whole process easier for chairs that have a lot of really loose joints. So wait a minute. What happened to the Next Level Carpentry shirt I was just wearing a few minutes ago? Yeah, that is kind of weird. What? I don't know where that Starbond shirt came from, but I went through wardrobe and they told me to put on this Next Level Carpentry t-shirt, so I did. Okay, we'll look into it and see if we can sort out the t-shirt problem later, but it might mean reviewing the staff in there at wardrobe to help them get their act together, but whether we figure it out or not, I'm just gonna roll with this. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, so why don't you roll on with the video and we'll sort out the t-shirt problem later. And it's actually appropriate because I'm going to be using Starbond products for these chair repairs, mainly their line of CA glues. Now this isn't a sponsored video from Starbond, but I do have affiliate links to the products because as you'll see, they work great and I use them here in the shop, have done for a long time. And there'll be a special offer code for the glue in the video description below. But as proof that I'm not a paid sponsor of Starbond, I'll tell you that any thin viscosity CA glue will work, although most other CA glue manufacturers don't have an accelerator, and that's a key component of this. So even if you use somebody else's thin CA glue, the whole thing goes better when you have accelerator to work with. But like I said, this chair will be low-hanging fruit because there's less wobble in it. And one thing about this process is that any joint that I treat with the CA glue gets really stiff. So when I start out, I'm making sure that the chair doesn't rock and that everything is right. Because if the chair is tilted off to one side and I glue something up, it's gonna stay tilted like that. So I wanna make sure to work with joints that are positioned so when they're stabilized, that's the way I want the chair to end up. And on any chair, there's gonna be different joints that need to be stabilized. This one, pretty much every joint does to a degree. So I'm gonna start with the simplest, easiest one first, which is a straightforward joint of these stretchers and the spreader down here, versus the joints up here on the legs where there's two members coming into the same area for the joinery. And I hope that becomes clear later, but I'll bring the camera in close, show you what I'm gonna fix down here and proceed. Starbond t-shirt and all. All right, I think you'll be able to see in this close-up what's going on here. Right in this corner here, so a little bit of movement between this cross stretcher and this one here. There's a little bit of movement in that gap. Not so much on this other side, but I'm gonna fix both of those joints at the same time. And here's a close-up of that joint so you can see the movement in here. And what you'll see with this method is, rather than separating the joint, applying glue and then putting the joint back together, I want to compress the pieces so that the joint is fully locked together and then add the glue, which is the biggest difference. And screw clamps tend to be the best because the amount of pressure you can get. I've got a number of varieties over here on the rack, but these Irwin F clamps are pretty nice, and they actually have some protective pads from EVS 3D printing on them, so it doesn't mar furniture, although the stock pads on a clamp like this will work fine. If you have the option for a screw clamp, there are squeeze clamps like this. They have big rubber jaws or plastic jaws. These work well, and you can get a fair amount of pressure, but a clamp like this with a screw on it can always get more pressure, and so I use this anytime I have a chance, but this clamp is better than no clamp. And with the nature of construction of this chair, I'm just going to be applying the clamp across that spreader like this. And I can just put the clamp on like this, bring it together, and then tighten it up. And I put a good bit of pressure on there to make sure that these joints are pulled together. And I want to make sure that the chair stays stable on the table, because if the chair rocks at this point like this, and I tighten up these joints, it'll stay rocking forever. So I'm making sure that the chair likes to sit where it is, everything's stable and that's tight. And I'm going to show you that joint tightening up again with a close-up. And here's what that looks like. You can see the movement in there, both ways of this, together and apart. That's probably 15 thousandths of an inch or so. Can be more or less, doesn't matter, but that's just what it is in this case. And now when I apply the clamp pressure, it just closes that gap right up. And that's exactly what I want on both sides. And with that clamp on there and the chair, all 4 feet of the chair resting firmly on the table, I know it's good to go. And I can just tip it on the side like this and apply the CA glue. And as you'll see going forward, a simple joint like this that glue gets applied from one direction, it all soaks in, it flows downhill into the joint, that's good. But I really like starting out with the clean, simple joints first, so as they get more complicated, I have a better idea of how the glue is going to flow and how the glue is going to flow into the joint and stabilize it. So again, I'll zoom in close so you can see this CA glue in action. Okay, here's a look at my setup here. I positioned the chair at an angle like this so the glue will flow down into that joint. You may or may not have that luxury for joints you're repairing, or you could just hold the chair. I've got a clamp over there to hold it in place. This clamp is still putting pressure on this joint this direction. I've got a paper towel for soaking up extra CA glue, and you might be more comfortable wearing nitrile gloves because it is possible to stick your fingers to the workpiece when this glue flows where it goes. And I'm using the Starbond Thin. This is like thin like water, and I always use that first in these joints. If a joint has a big gap, as you'll see later, I can use the medium and the thick for gap filling, but I start out with the thin. And when you buy Starbond CA glue, it comes in a package like this. There's 2 nozzles and then a pack of these micro tips in each package. And I generally find that I switch out the 2 main nozzles about halfway through the bottle, because no matter how careful I am with tip hygiene, they get clogged up. But that's where this stuff comes from. And the main nozzle is fine for a lot of applications, but in this case, I want to be very specific about where the glue goes. So I've got one of the micro tips, and I'm just going to take a little bit off the end and then place this over the end of the bottle, and that helps control the application so I can focus on the exact spot where I want it to go. And I added a little bit of extra light there so you can see what's going on, because this process is somewhat counterintuitive and it's just easier to understand when you can see it at work. So here's the thin CA glue, standard tip with a micro tip, and you can just see it dripping out of here. And because it's thin as water, it just soaks into that joint. And it's soaking into the joint between the shoulder of this piece, and it's also flowing down into the little tenon that goes into this piece. And I'm just letting it run in there. I'm not using accelerator at this point. Now you can see it's starting to come out the bottom. So I know that that joint is nice and full. And because this piece is varnished, I can just wipe off that excess glue. Just like that. I'm going to add a little more, and if it runs out right away, then I have a real good idea that that's stabilized. You want to do this with plenty of ventilation because as this glue dries or cures and off gases, it can be pretty stinky. But that's about what the process goes like. And use caution when using a rag or a paper towel, because if you get too much glue in a concentrated wad of this, it'll smoke, and I think it can actually start on fire. And these little steps and cautions apply to every step of the process. And now that I'm confident I've got good filling action there, I'm going to add some Starbond accelerator to help cure that a little faster, because I want it to fill up on the outside. This accelerator will soften a varnish finish until it evaporates or off gases. So if the finish is an issue, keep that in mind. But now this is going to want to set up faster and be less likely to run through the joint. A little bit running out here, so I'm feeling really good about the way that that joint filled up. Start to run out here. So that's looking really good. The accelerator sets this stuff in seconds. So that is nice and hard in there. If I get too much glue, I can scrape it out. But as it is, I feel really good about that joint. Now I'm going to flip the chair just because I'm demonstrating this and put some glue in from the other direction. All right, now that I've finished the side over there, I'm going to flip this around once again. This clamp just serves as my brace for positioning. That'll work fine. Hold this in a nice position here. And I'll just repeat the process on this side. The joint here was a little tighter than over there, so I don't expect it to soak up as much of this thin Starbond CA glue right off the bat, but it is wicking in there, and that's the important part of starting with the thin, because you want it to get down in there and consolidate any loose wood fibers or crumbs of old glue that are in that joint that got in there as it loosened up. Now I've got glue running out the bottom, so I know I'm getting where I need to be with this whole thing. Little accelerator in here to keep that under control. And then that glue starts to cure on the outside. And it's useful to soak up that extra CA that's running out. But if not, I'll show later, I can clean up these joints with a sharpened putty knife and make everything look nice in case you're working on something where you're doing a restoration and need to apply a new stain finish on it. There's a little bit of a hole over here, just a little chipped away piece of wood, so I'm using extra CA glue, a little extra accelerator. And I'll say at this point that switching up to another viscosity of glue will help fill that spot quicker. And I was a little irresponsible with the cap on my medium CA glue, so I'll use another little accessory from EVS, which is a crusty cap cranker. I can take that little cap off of there and then use this medium CA glue to fill up that spot. I'll show a close-up of this on one of the other joints later, but I'm just going to do this now because everything's in position. The chair, the camera, and everything. So one little dab of medium does what about 5 or 10 coats of the thin will do. But it doesn't have the same capillary action, so that's why I'm using it. I'll flip this over one more time. And now I can fill this last corner. Okay, you'll have to take my word for it that this is now the other side of the chair. And as I've turned this over, I think you'll be able to see that the glue that came through from the other side already sealed up. There's a fillet of glue going through that corner. I'll add a little more just so you can see what I'm talking about. So the glue is staying on the outside. It's not really soaking in. So I'm just going to cure it out and then say that I'm done with that side. And you can probably see some of that CA already soaked through, but I'm going to go ahead and make sure it's good and full from this angle. And it's not soaking in, so I'm feeling really good about that. And I'll add accelerator to complete the process. Just like that. And it should go without saying that this whole process goes a whole lot faster when I'm not switching camera positions and explaining things. You know, this is 5 minutes worth of work. Throw a clamp on there, make sure everything's stabilized, flip it around, get the CA glue in there, and it's all done. And because of the fact that I'm not using accelerator on the initial set, that CA glue takes a little longer to really cure out in that stretcher. So I'm going to take a break in shooting the video here and let that get good and dry, because the joints are so small, it's critical that they really hold together nicely. But after waiting a while, I'll come back and do the other joints on these stretchers while I'm kind of focused on the bottom end of this chair. And that just gives you an overview of when you're fixing a piece of furniture, kind of deciding where to start and where to end up with the various joints, so you don't get yourself backed into a corner where something is glued together while something else is racked. But you always want to build going forward so that when everything is done and the chair is stable again, that it's still square and everything sits like it needs to. After giving the CA and those first two joints adequate time to set up so that I'm confident they'll stay together, I'm going to advance to the next batch of joints. I can remove this clamp and get set up to stabilize the joints where these stretchers or spreaders go into the legs on both sides. Kind of the same setup. There's not a ton of movement down there, but there is some. And the bigger problem is that this joint right here and this front leg and this one on the back leg have completely failed. So while the joints are apart, I could clean them up and apply some tight bond glue in there to hold it together. I want to demonstrate the strength and the speed of the CA glue. So rather than use that tight bond glue, I'm just going to put these in position here, clamp it up, and apply the water thin CA glue so you can see how quick it is and how effective it is. But let me bring the camera in close so you can see the condition of this joint before I clamp it and apply the glue. All right, so this is what that joint looks like. It's loose, it just comes apart, but the glue that's in there is pretty stable, and it makes a tight fit when it's put together like this. And that's the perfect environment for the CA glue to do a great job of holding this together. So rather than filing this off and cleaning out the mortise for regular wood glue, I'll just put it into place before clamping it and applying the CA glue. If I flip the chair over like this, you can see that this back leg is about the same way. You know, the wood is good, everything's fine. And even if this wood was frayed and punky, the CA glue penetrates the wood fibers and will hold it together remarkably well. Whereas if I was using tight bond glue or something, I'd have to clean off all that loose material, clean out the mortise, and put everything back together before applying something like tight bond and clamps. So I hope what you see here demonstrates the effective of CA glue when stabilizing loose joints. And while I've got the camera set up here, you can see that the joint on this back leg on the other side is actually pretty stable. Just like the front one, those are pretty good. They're tight and sealed up, so I'm not even going to have to do anything to those at this stage of the game, but I sure could if they were loose like the other joints. Okay, there's nothing really magic here. I'm just using the same Irwin clamps to stabilize these. Actually, I'll put the clamp in this way so it stays in position. And I'm doing this with the chair upright, sitting on my perfectly flat work surface here, just to make sure I'm not clamping in any rock into this chair. Just want to make sure that the joints are tight and the chair is firmly sitting on all 4 feet during the process. So now when I apply the glue, it'll lock it in the right position rather than locking it in the wrong position. And I'm reapplying the clamp pressure here so you can see how the clamp pulls that joint together. It's not all that dramatic in this application, but I just want to make sure that that thing is really seated well before I apply the CA glue, because that's the position I want it to stay in. I added a little light on the subject here as I begin to apply the CA on this mortise and tenon joint here. And because it's a blind tenon, I'm not worried about extra CA coming out the other side, but I'm just going to keep adding it till it won't take anymore. You can see when I add on two sides of this joint but not the other two, but it all looks the same. I just want to put plenty of it in there. You can see it dripping out of this tip here. I'm just letting it soak in. And keep in mind that I didn't use accelerator on this because I don't want the CA to set up on the surface here. I want it to wick way down into that joint, make sure all the voids and any loose fibers or wood or anything in there are saturated with CA glue, which I wouldn't get if I cured the CA on the surface. I keep alternating where I'm applying the glue just to let it do its thing and soak down into that joint. Make sure it's nice and full and that all the contact surfaces are well coated with the CA for maximum strength when it all cures. Naturally, by volume, a CA glue is much more expensive than a wood glue like Titebond or something like that. But the value of being able to stabilize a joint like this without taking it apart with risk of damaging parts and the speed of the application and the stabilization quickly offsets extra cost for the CA itself. If you remember the previous close-up, the end of the tenon for this joint is tapered and the mortise is square. So there's actually a relatively large amount of empty space inside this joint. And even if I fill that extra space up with the CA, it's not going to make the joint any stronger. So I keep that in mind as I'm applying the glue here and decide that even though CA keeps running into the joint, at some point I'm just filling the void to no extra effect and stop to move on to the next joint, confident that I've applied enough of the glue to stabilize the joint and that I'm not just wasting more glue by filling empty space inside the leg mortise. And before I move on, I give the bottle a tap to encourage excess CA to run down out of that micro tip so I can continue to use it on the other joints without having to use another micro tip. And after my final lap around the tenon, applying fresh CA, I wipe off excess and give the area a spritz of accelerator so that everything's sealed up. And if there's any CA in there that's still in the curing process, this will keep it from just running out and give it time to set up inside the joint for stabilization. While the chair is in this orientation, I'm going to add a little of the CA on the other front leg joint, even though it was really solid, just to make sure there's no gaps in there that CA won't help stabilize while everything's set up and I'm in the process of stabilizing. And judging by the way that CA kind of pools on the surface, I'm convinced that the joint is already tight enough and stable enough that this step isn't necessary. After waiting a few minutes for that joint to set and stabilize, I'm going to flip this over, reposition the clamps so I can add the CA to that back leg joint to further stabilize a beautiful but wobbly old chair. All right, I've got everything reclamped and repositioned so I can go ahead and start the CA stabilization process on this tenon as well. I don't know if you can tell in the camera, but there's a bit more of a gap on the bottom side of this stretcher here, so that glue is really going to run in there. So I'm going to give it a good, healthy initial dose, and then I'm going to up to the medium CA to get a little more gap filling in that spot. But the initial CA gets down there and wicks in. Now maybe it's just a shallow gap because the CA is pooling on there, and so I'm not going to switch to medium CA because there's really nowhere for it to go down in there, which is a good thing. I can see a few bubbles coming out of there that tell me that the glue is getting where it needs to go and doing what it needs to do, which is a wonderful thing. Yeah, that's actually quite surprising. I thought that this joint was going to take a lot more, but after just a couple laps around there, it's just puddling on the surface, nothing going on there, so I know it's done what it needs to do. And I can just wipe off the excess here and give it a spritz of accelerator and call it done. And I figure while I'm set up and doing everything, I'll take one lap around the other rear tenon, even though it was snug in place, just to make sure it won't take on any extra CA to improve stabilization overall. And I quickly confirmed that this joint is already sealed up and stable because it's not accepting any of this water-thin CA. So I'm feeling good about the strength of that joint as well. And that should complete the stabilization process for all the bottom legs and stretchers. You can see the chair is nice and sturdy here. I'm going to leave those clamps on for a little bit just because I can. And I want to make sure that that glue has the best chance of setting when it's down inside that joint. It can take a little bit longer, but you get the idea of the process for this. And I can already notice that the stabilizing effect is starting to take hold, even though I've just done these joints on the bottom. But now I can proceed to the joints up on the top that are really going to make a difference in the overall stability of this chair. Now that this lower framework is all stabilized, I can pop the clamps off and plan for the next collection of joints that need to be stabilized. And on this chair, I've decided to stabilize this back framework. There's some side-to-side movement in here because of playing this joint here, and because this panel's loose and there's a little gaps up here. And again, all these joints are loose enough to wobble, but not so loose that I can just take them apart. None of this stuff really comes apart without potential damage. So I'll tackle that next. And every chair, every piece of furniture is going to be different, and these chairs are no different. That sounded different in my head. Anyways, I'm going to start by adding a clamp in the back here. Let's go this way to put pressure across this back rail here. And every step of the way, I want to make sure the chair is still sitting flat on that table. I don't want to clamp something and have it start to rock. After all, this is not a rocking chair. It's not supposed to be. So that's going to be good. And then I'll deploy these soft jaw squeeze clamps up here because they easily compensate for this angled top up here. And that pressure brings all the joints tight. You can see I got some rocking in there after I put that clamp on. So I want to make sure that balances out again before I proceed. There we go. So now that back frame is all stabilized and clamps tight. So I can go ahead and start applying the water-thin CA glue to those joints for the stabilization process. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the two joints at the top of the chair's sides here. I repositioned the camera to give you a real nice clear close-up view of this joint. And even though there's clamp pressure on here, you can see there's still space in the joint. You can just see right through that joint. So that tells me that this wood shrunk and that tenon is bottomed out in this piece. But because I can't take the chair apart without destroying it, I'm just going to fix it like this. And again, I'll start with the thin CA to kind of wick down into that joint to whatever extent it can. And I'm just using the regular nozzle here to get plenty of that CA down in there. It just flows right in. And you can see here it's starting to run out the bottom a little bit, which is okay. But this is behaving a little different than I anticipated. So I went and put a micro tip on there and get that glue going right down in there above that tenon. Hopefully that'll cause it to stabilize the joint and just not run out the other side. Now that I feel good about that water thin getting into the joinery itself, and I'm going to step up to the medium rather than jumping all the way to thick, so that this slightly thinner viscosity will still get deep into the joint before setting up or coagulating in the open part of the joint. You can see how this behaves differently than the water thin. And I'll add a little spritz of accelerator to kind of get that set up, because now I'm gap filling and not joint stabilizing. And that's a good progression of first stabilizing the joint and then working to fill up the gap. Now, because of the flowing properties of CA, I'm going to have to finish this joint from the other side. But first, I'll get caught up on the joint on the other side of the chair with these same steps and the chair in the same position. The joint on the other side is a little tighter than the one I just did, but I can still see space through there from the angle I'm looking, which is not the camera angle. I'll just start with that thin CA application process. All the same. I just keep letting that glue flow in there until it starts to run out the other side. It tells me if it's got somewhere to go or not. There it goes, it's starting to come out the other side. But the capillary action and the way this stuff flows is probably the key to why it works so well. Because if you try to use a thicker glue, it just seals up on the outside, never gets in there where it's needed for stabilization. I'm feeling good about that part, so I'm going to give it a little spritz of accelerator here and step up to the medium. I can just watch the surface of the glue there and tell when it quits flowing into the crack or to that little gap. Well, that should do it for those two side joints there. So I'm going to work on the upper end of this back panel here. You can see it moves back and forth and it can slide up and down. So I'm just going to center it up in the mortise here. Kind of get it centered top and bottom like that. And also center it up and down. And I'm going to go with that for right now. The joint does fit nice and snug, nice and tight. So I can start with the thin CA glue without a micro tip. Just get a good wicking application of it here. You can just see that CA just runs right down in there. Apply a little accelerator to that. Give it another application. I just want this to quit running in. But I don't really want buildup on the face of on the surface of the varnish, so I'm going to kind of wipe that off. And I'll remind you that the acetone in that accelerator does soften the finish on this. But because these chairs are probably going to get sanded and refinished before they go to their new forever home, I'm just not too concerned about that right now. I keep looking on the underside and I'm not seeing any CA glue come out underneath there, which is okay in this instance because there's so much surface area on this joint with this back as a tenon and that mortise there, that this is already just going to be stable as can be. And I'll back the whole thing up by applying CA glue on the front side as well after I'm done back here. Now I can tell that that thin CA is starting to puddle here. It's not running in on this side. So that's good and full. And I'll just apply a little more on this side where it's still running in. And every joint's a little different. So you just kind of got to watch it, see how it behaves, and apply the glue accordingly. And this side is still taking quite a bit of the thin, so I'm going to stop up that leak by applying some medium. Kind of fill that gap and give that joint the most strength it can have. And that is one thirsty joint. I kind of get the feeling there's a void in there somewhere, that I'm just pooling CA glue in there, but I'm reassured that none's running out the front, so I'm going to switch to the thick for this little corner here. Actually, that's a new tip, so I'm just going to snip this off. And now we should get some flow. There it is. See, that behaves completely different from the other two viscosities. And once again, a trifecta of viscosities stabilizes the joint. And this is going quite nicely according to plan, even though I don't really have a plan. So I can carefully flip this over and apply glue to the front. And you might not be able to see it in the camera here, but I've got some of that thin CA glue is leaking out of that joint. Got in there and wasn't able to set. I'm just going to clean that up while I'm at it here. And I feel like those two clamps aren't necessary because the joint is stable enough. And here again, the chair is still nice and stable, so I can proceed with applying the CA glue to the front of these joints to complete the stabilization process. But I need to prop this up for good glue penetration, for good glue flow, and this clamp should work nicely. I repositioned the camera to bring you in on the action of applying CA glue to the front of these joints. And this still shot of the camera boom arm in the Next Level Carpentry shop gives you an idea of the rather complicated setup it takes to get a good camera angle that brings viewers in close to the action. And now I can see if this setup works as good as I think it will when I start the water-thin CA glue application process. I really like the way that looks. The front of this joint was tighter than the back, and I think that's all it's going to take to firm up this face of the joint. And I can proceed with the water thin to finish filling the gaps and joinery on the sides of the chair legs where they meet the top rail. And with all the CA that's soaked in from the other side, I don't need to do much here to finish this up. And something I noticed with the chair in this position is that there's a kink in this side piece here. The grain might show up in the video there. Was a knot probably right here in this piece, and as it dried, it got a pretty good kink in there, which kind of explains the fit of this joint here. This piece has got a little bit of a twist as well. The joint isn't perfect, but at least now everything's going to be solid, so I can carry on by applying glue to the bottom of this back panel. Now I simply stand up the chair so that I can apply the CA glue to the bottom end of this back panel. And I'm checking this each step of the way just to make sure it's still resting nicely and square and flat on the table, to make sure I'm not building something crooked into this as I stabilize each joint in succession. Well, that's all looking good. And this panel is stabilized in between the sides of this. It was free to move around before, and you can actually see that the original wood is chipped away. And if I was doing a restoration versus a stabilization, I would infill those two little chunks that broke out when this panel was loose and the chair was moving around. But I can just go ahead and let that water thin just wick down in there, just like so many times before. I got plenty of thin down in there, so I'm going to go up to medium to finish sealing up this crack on this side. I should say the gap on this side. And I'll finish off a little bit on this edge with the thick. And after repositioning the chair and the camera, go ahead and apply the CA glue to the bottom of the front of the back panel into its slot mortise on the back rail of the chair, in the same sequence and manner as before. And again, as before, I finish up with a dab of the thick CA on both sides of the joint where the gap is a little wider. And now with about half the joints in the chair glued up and stabilized, you can see this is getting a lot more rigid already, especially with the back panel and the back frame stabilized. This is coming along quite nicely. You can see there's just a little bit of rock in this chair. So when I clamp up the rest of it, if I still have the rock, I'll do some counter shimming to take that wobble out of it before gluing up the final joints that matter, to keep this stationary chair from developing rocking chair syndrome, so that now I can proceed from the more basic simple joints to the more complex joinery here to eliminate the rest of the wobble in this heirloom chair. Now that the CA in all the joints I've stabilized already has had plenty of time to set up and cure, this is really stable, and I've still got the batch of joints around the seat frame here to do. So I'm more than pleased with the results of the stabilization on this old chair. And I can move on to the last batch of joints here around the seat frame. And using the previous analogy of low-hanging fruit, I'm going to have to climb up into the tree a ways because the low-hanging fruit is all gone. But with a background of stabilizing these other joints, this will be a lot more understandable at this stage of the game. So I'll just deploy the Irwin F-clamps to tighten up the joinery around here so you can see a straightforward method of getting this done. But I'll also mention, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there's a way to make this clamping process even more straightforward, but it involves some specialized clamps, and I wanted to make sure viewers can see how it's done with conventional clamps in a more conventional method. So I'll go ahead and deploy these F-clamps in a pretty straightforward manner. You can imagine that the joints in here need to be tightened up, so I can just put clamps front and back like this to close up the gaps in the seat frame so they're ready for the application of that thin CA. And let me bring the camera in close so you can see a little bit of what this looks like, even though you're already familiar with the clamping step of stabilizing joints. And even though there's 8 separate joints on this seat frame, I'm just going to use this one as an example because you can see through the joint from that camera angle, and I'll be able to get that joint closed up with a lot of pressure with one of these seat clamps. But because of shrinkage of the wood and detritus in the joints, the gap probably won't close up 100%. And I really have to bear down on this clamp to close it up even as much as I did. But even tightening the gap up a little bit is better than nothing, and the results are more than acceptable for this particular project. And while I'm at it, with the camera set up in its current position, I'll add a clamp to the back of the seat frame as well before I start applying CA to these joints. And the joints on the back of the seat frame close up acceptably with this clamp and modest pressure. With those 4 clamps applied and the gaps all nice and tight, I've developed a little bit of a problem, which is a rock in the chair here, and I'm going to show you one way to address that. Although there's always the last ditch option of leveling a leg a little bit. If when you get all done with the chair, it's nice and firm and solid, but it still rocks, I can take about a 1/16 of an inch off the bottom of one of these legs and straighten that out if the method I'm going to show you fails. It's going to be a little tricky to show this, but if you notice, the chair is rocking in this direction, so these 2 legs are high and the other 2 legs are low. And what I need to do is raise this leg or lower that leg. And I can do that by adjusting the clamp pressure on the front or the rear frame. I'm going to use the front frame because the back is already pretty solid. I'm just going to take all this pressure off here and release this clamp. And the wobble is still in there, and these gaps have opened up a little bit. So I'm just going to adjust the position of this clamp. See how I can do this. And my goal is to change the front of this frame. It's a parallelogram now that's like this because this leg is lower, causing it to rock. So if I can shift the parallelogram this way with clamp pressure, I can change the shape here from a parallelogram to a square. And let's see, I need to raise this leg to keep it from rocking. So I'll put the clamp on at an angle in this direction. See how this is across here? So this will put angled pressure across that joint instead of straight pressure. It's a little tricky to keep the clamp in position like this and put pressure on it at the same time, but let's see if I can get this done. I'm exaggerating a little bit here with the angle of this clamp, but you can see even with that clamp pressure, the chair quit rocking because I've raised this leg with that clamp pressure. But I still want to add a bunch of pressure to tighten up the joint. So let's see how that works. That's pretty good, but this clamp pad wants to walk as I tighten it. So I'm going to do a little cheat here to help address that. And the best way to do that is by adding a drop of 3-in-1 oil and a little ball on this clamp here to reduce the friction between the screw and the clamp pad because friction in there is what causes that clamp pad to rotate as I tighten the clamp and cause the pad to walk as I tighten it. So we're going to go around 2 here. Oh yeah, that works nicely because I can get that clamp pad to just pretty much stay in place on that slippery varnish. Apply pressure to the joint to tighten the gap and adjust the position of those front legs all at the same time. So now the gaps are as tight as they're going to get. The chair is as stable as it's going to get, and I can move this chair around into different positions to get the CA glue to wick down into those joints to stabilize them and maintain the rock-free orientation of the legs. And now with everything clamped tight in place and the chair rock-free and proud, I can start applying the CA glue, and it really doesn't matter where I start. So I'm just making a command decision to start with the joints on this front rail here at the top of the seat frame. And I'll start by running the CA down from the top. And part of the reason I'm doing that is no matter which way I apply the CA glue, it'll run out as you saw before, and I'll be able to get this process started and easily pick up that extra that runs out the bottom. And another thing that probably doesn't show up in the camera from that distance and that angle is that the fit of a lot of these joints is tapered. It's wider on one side or the top or the bottom than the other. These front joints are fairly equal all the way around. But on the back of the chair, if you look close on these joints between this back rail and the sides, it's open on the bottom. And it just makes more sense to apply the CA so it flows from the wide portion to the skinny portion. So when I do these, I'll flip the chair over. But like I said, these front joints are pretty parallel, so it doesn't really matter where I start first. And that'll vary from piece to piece and joint to joint. But those are some of the factors I'm weighing as I make this decision to get started on that front rail. As always, I've got a paper towel for wiping up excess that is inevitably going to run out of these joints. And I've got my arsenal of Starbond CA products here, thin, medium, and thick CA, and then the 6-ounce aerosol accelerator. And if you like this little caddy that I carry these around in, there's a link in the video description over there that shows how to make a caddy like this. And this is the caddy that was made in that video. Makes it super handy for keeping all the viscosities and accelerator close at hand on a job like this. As it turns out, the joint on this side of the chair is wider at the top than the bottom, so it actually turns out to be an ideal place to start this process because I can just run the thin CA glue right down in the top of that, and it'll flow down into that constriction down below. There's also a crack in the top of this chair leg that I'm sure runs down into the tenon. So I'm just going to flow some of this down into that crack as well. Can't hurt. And it'll help to stabilize things. Starting to run out the bottom now, which is a good thing as before. So I'll add a little bit of accelerator to start the cure process of that water thin as it runs through the joint. Now that I'm confident I've got enough of the thin down there, I switch to medium and see if I can do a little filling of that joint. Ultimately, I want it to be all full right out to the surface. And I keep applying the medium viscosity here because it keeps flowing. I could switch to the thick to get it to fill up that gap, but I like the way it's flowing down in there and filling the gap because at this stage in this position, I don't think it's flowing into a void anywhere. The more thoroughly that gap gets filled, the more stable the joint will be when it's all done. I'm really liking the way that looks. There's a little excess CA here on the outside, but I'll scrape that clean after a while. And to finish up, I'll go with some thick right there in the top to fill that joint. And as before, it doesn't take that thick long to fill a little gap like that. And I can wipe off the excess and accelerate it to finish up. And that should do nicely for that joint. Now I'll move to this one, and looking close, this joint is actually wider in the front and the bottom than the top and the back. So I'll flip the chair for better glue penetration that leads to better stabilization. As you might imagine, a project like this is more dynamic than static, So I'm constantly rechecking things, and I noticed the rock in the chair had reversed. So I repositioned this clamp so the chair is stable and repositioned the chair so that you can see this gap. And I think it'll show up that this gap is noticeably wider at the front than the back, which is a good thing. And I can begin the CA filling process. And you can see how quickly and thoroughly that thin CA flows down into this joint. Another thing about this particular joint is that there's a tenon from this piece running into a mortise in this piece. So as that glue flows down, it's going to hit the cheek of that mortise and run this way into the joint. So I'm really loading it up with thin CA to make sure it really gets in that corner, because that's going to be key to this front frame staying stable and square that keeps the chair legs from rocking. And I really like the way that's behaving. So I'll step up to the medium for a little more filling and a little less flowing. And because of the brace in the front corner of this chair, it's a little bit difficult to see and wipe up the excess CA that's running out the bottom, but I can chase it down with the paper towel and clean it up to the extent that it matters. And it won't hurt anything if the CA fills the gap between the brace and the side rail for more stabilization either. So that penetration and fill is looking great, and I can finish up with a little dab of the thick CA right in the widest part of the gap at the bottom to finish up at this point. Now that the two joints are filled from the top and from the front, I flip the chair over for access to the joints on this back rail because they're wider at the bottom and the CA will flow better from this direction. I checked the chair for flat before I flipped it over, and I'm using parallel blocks under here on the seat frame, which will support the chair evenly compared to just resting it on the clamps that are on here. And while the chair's in this position, I can also add some extra CA into the underside of that front rail and possibly to some of these sides. And I know this is monotonous, tedious, and pretty obvious, but as I've said before, every chair is different and this chair is no different. So I just want to give you an overview of some of the situations you might encounter and various ways of addressing them. And that makes these two chairs an ideal case study because every joint is loose. In many chairs, there'll be one or two, and it's a lot simpler to just, put on one clamp, glue from one position, and move a clamp, and you're done. But I think it's more instructional to have an extreme case like this to cover so many more bases. Since I started this project with a partial bottle of the thin CA, I've got to break open a new package here for a new bottle. And I thought I'd just show you some more reasons that I like the Starbond CA products. It comes with a nice full bottle, a 2-ounce bottle of the super fast thin CA. And this is the new bottle and package design, which includes a container with extra tips and accessories, plus some cautions and instructions that may or may not be included in this video. Little homework there, study that up. And inside here, there's a red tip unclogger here. That'll keep the tip clean once you've put a hole in the top of the tip. Then there are micro tips like I've been using in some of the joints here. There's plenty to use. And then there's 2 of the tips with the new design. You can tell the new design because the cap is rounded here. It's got a little sleeve inside that may or may not show up. But that sleeve fits down inside the neck of the bottle. When the cap is screwed on, that makes it for a tighter seal, a better flow into the tip, and better long-term storage of the product without getting everything gummed up. And the new rounded tip is less prone to sticking and clogging when it's stuck onto the main nozzle. So I'll get this tip clipped off so the glue will flow and carry on stabilizing joints on this chair. At this point in the video, this step is pretty much routine, so I'm just fast forwarding the video just to give you a general idea of what the process looks like stabilizing the joints on the sides of the back rail on the underside of the chair. It's all done. Glue really flows out of that new bottle of thin CA, so it doesn't take long to pump that joint nice and full. So I'm confident that the tenon inside the leg is thoroughly coated and will be really stable when it's all done. And after spending a minute or so on the thin, I switch to medium, as before, to start filling the gap, adding some accelerator in the process so the joint fills fuller quicker. And as in pretty much every joint before, I finish up with some thick CA to fill the last widest part of the gap in this joint. And as you'd expect, with the chair in this position and the camera setup, I stabilize the joint on the opposite end of the rail with the same setup at the same time. And something about the nature of the fit of the joint on this side allows that thin to just flow right on through, and actually puddled on the floor before I noticed. So I switched to the medium to fill the gap instead of just running glue down onto the floor of the shop. And I hope this gives you a pretty good overview of some of the things you might encounter when stabilizing joints on different pieces of furniture. Because even though every joint is basically the same, they're all somewhat unique and require an adaptive approach rather than a predetermined scripted approach. Taking full advantage of the position of the camera, the light, and the chair, I continue by filling gaps in the underside of the front rail and start filling the front of the one side rail where the joint is wider on the bottom than the top. And this sequence is just meant to demonstrate that often a thorough job is a monotonous job, but even a monotonous job is efficient when so many joints are involved and so many angles for filling and stabilizing those joints are involved. And another good thing to keep in mind here is that even though this is time-consuming and monotonous, it's many times faster than what it would take to disassemble the chair completely, prep all the joints, and glue and clamp them in the traditional chair building process used when this chair was made, probably 100 years ago. Now I can finish up stabilizing joints from this angle by going through the CA sequence on the bottom of the other side rail where it meets the back leg. The thin CA runs through quickly, so I switch to medium right away and finish off with some thick to fill the relatively large gap on the bottom of the back of this side rail. I discover that even the medium CA wants to flow through this joint because of the size of the gap, so I switch to thick to finish the filling process. Well, that phase of the joint stabilization went great, and I turned the chair over after all that stuff was done, and it still rests nice and flat on the saw table here, so that's a good thing. I don't have to do any alternate reclamping or anything to get stuff straightened out. And I can proceed with just filling up a few little voids in some of the joints. This one in particular, this was pretty wide on the outside. I filled it from the top and the bottom. There's still a gap here. And everything is rigid enough that I'm not worried about anything shifting while I'm doing this, but I'm leaving the clamps on to fill this up. And it's at this stage when you'd want to do that sort of thing. I'll go around and look at the other joints just to make sure everything is filled to maximize the stabilization of the joints. And on many other pieces of furniture, different chairs and stuff, this would be considered a final step in the joint stabilization process. And this camera angle and lighting should give you a bird's eye view of what the CA glue application process looks like, where I start with the thin, follow with medium, and finish up with thick. Previous filling of this joint makes me confident that it's already filled with the thin CA, but I run a good dose of it down in there just in case there was a face of a tenon in there somewhere that didn't get coated. And after that, I switched to the medium just to see how it behaves here. And as you can see, the medium just puddles on the surface, so I wipe off the excess and hit it with accelerator to finish up here. And that went rather swimmingly, if I do say, and I did say, so I can pull the clamps off now and basically wrap up the stabilization process of this first of the two chairs you saw at the beginning of the video and move on with the more advanced method that I mentioned early in the video. I will say one thing here. There's these 4 angle braces in the corners that support the seat cushion and provide a place for attaching that cushion. And those are screwed in with old slot head screws. There's some gaps in between the braces and the frame, but this thing is so solid, I'm not gonna mess with those. But with the way they're installed, with those slot head wood screws, I'm sure that if they were loose or weak, I could remove the screws, give them a tap with a hammer and break them loose. And because the joiner is all open and clean, I could just scrape the mating surfaces, use some tight bond glue, and screw them back on. That's probably how I'd approach that, even though because there's some gaps in there, I could use the CA glue filling sequence with these. But in this case, the Titebond type glue would be better. Mainly because by removing the screws, the bracket would just pop out with no damage to either piece. It'd be easy to remove, easy to clean up, easy to glue, and easy to screw back in for a super solid connection if it was needed. And what a difference CA makes. This chair is solid as a rock, and the only thing it'll wobble on is if there's a bump in the floor. And when you compare it to the wobbly bobbly it started out as, this is quite a dramatic improvement, especially considering no disassembly was required to transform the chair from this to this. And with all the tips and tricks I've shown you so far, you've seen that this can be done with regular clamps and very standard tools and supplies in a regular shop. And even though this is a next level approach to stabilizing an old chair, I want to take this to the next level and show you an advanced way to speed up the process but get the same results with the special next level clamp that really streamlines the process. While I shift gears here, I'll mention that you can find links to pretty much everything I use in this video in the description below. You'll find tools like clamps and supplies like my favorite shop towels through the Amazon link. The link to Spring has swag like the Next Level Carpentry t-shirt I was wearing at the beginning of this video, even though I still don't know how I ended up in this Starbond shirt. Speaking of Starbond, there's a link to their website where you can get all the excellent CA glue products you saw used here to stabilize this chair, plus an exclusive discount code for Next Level Carpentry viewers. And while you're there, let me know if you see my missing t-shirt lying around somewhere, will you? There's also a link to Patreon for anyone interested in joining the above and beyond group of patrons whose support helps keep the lights on here at Next Level Carpentry during gaps in video production for YouTube videos like this one. All active patrons have access to an extensive list of behind-the-scenes videos that give insight into niche projects from my day job that don't really warrant full-on video production, but do show some interesting stuff that I feel is truly next level, like the elegant cast stone fireplace surround project shown in this video thumbnail from that collection. Patrons also get some patron-only perks from time to time, like a new one I'll mention in a minute. Last but not least, I can tell you to expect a change in the way I share recommendations on future YouTube videos. I'm currently building an all-inclusive Next Level Carpentry recommendations page on a new platform called Rec League. I'm pretty jazzed about it because it's a much better way to present everything I recommend in YouTube videos, on my day job, and from hobbies I'm passionate about, and all in a more organized way that's easier to keep current. I'll include a link to a pre-launch version of the page with this video so viewers can check out how the excellent built-in search function helps sort through hundreds of recommendations to focus in on specific items of interest. Ultimately, anyone interested in curated collections of the wide range of tools and supplies that I use and personally recommend, plus recommendations for my avid hobbies like hiking, biking, rock hounding, and exploring, as well as collections of other random things that I really like, will be able to subscribe to my Rec League page on a monthly, yearly, or lifetime basis. Subscribers will have access to my recommendations for all the good stuff I choose personally with the same level of scrutiny I use for tools and supplies for Next Level Carpentry videos and use on a daily basis. The new perk for patrons I mentioned just a minute ago is that their current patronage amount can go towards a subscription to the Next Level Carpentry page on Rec League, which is about as sweet as a self-licking ice cream cone, isn't it? And now, after all that talk about recommendations and Rec League, I'll start with Merrill band clamps as a next level way to speed up the clamping process for stabilizing all the joints on the second old wobbly heirloom chair. You might not be familiar with band clamps, but I've learned that having band clamps in the shop is like having a superpower, especially on a project like this where so many F-clamps are needed to do the same job. And if I were to do all the joints at one time, I'd need 7 of these clamps, 3 on the bottom, 4 on the top, and I can replace that with just 2 band clamps. So because there's no such thing as too many clamps, I think band clamps are a great addition to anyone's clamp collection. I'm the first to admit that band clamps can be kind of unwieldy to work with the first few times, but with a bit of patience, I think you'll find, like I have, that any extra fuss is well worth it because of how well they work for projects that they're designed for. So inside this little canister here, there's a long coiled band. And it's just deploy it like that. There's some of the unwieldy part. And then this clamp, you'll see, tightens the band when it's in use. The way this clamp is set up right now, I've got the main jaw on there, and then I've got 3 additional jaws because I'm clamping a square object. But you can eliminate one of these jaws if you're clamping a triangle, and you can add them if you're clamping a more complex shape. But as it is, I've got 4 of these jaws on here, and I'm just going to pull a bunch of this band through here. And I just want enough of that band out so that I can wrap around the legs of this chair. I'm just going to spread it out here on the worktop here. And you can see with these gymnastics what I'm talking about. It's a little unwieldy to work with. But now that I've got those jaws spread out, I'm just going to set the chair in the middle of the hoop and then go about tightening up the clamp. And I do that just by pulling this band here until the jaws are closer to where they need to be. If you had 2 people, this would be a simpler task. But I'll show you that can be done alone. And once I've got all the jaws approximately where I want them, I just pull on that strap and then I turn this clamp handle to get it close. And then I can use the screw handle here to start snugging those up. As I keep saying, every chair is different, and this chair is no different. So with this chair, I want to move this clamp up to the upper seat frame here. So I'm just going to tilt it back on this block and kind of inch it along. Kind of keep everything under control here. And I just keep sliding, adjusting, and sliding until it's in the position I want, which is on this upper seat frame. And I just find that that's easier than trying to drop the clamp down over the top to end up with the same result. But now that this is in place and I can put some tension on it, I'll bring the camera in close so you can see these joints tighten up a little bit as I put the screws to this clamp. And for cinematic effect, I've focused in on the joint that's got the biggest gap here at the front of one of the front legs so that you can see it close up as I tighten up all 8 joints on the upper seat frame simultaneously with one clamp. And that is super snug, like the rest of the joints here where the spreader meets the leg. With that done, I can wind up the excess band here by cranking and then letting go of that little snap handle. And flip the chair up and deploy a second band clamp to tighten up the joints on those stretchers and spreaders. And after the requisite few minutes of fussing and fitting, I've got the clamp in position. But before I put tension on it, I've got to take a couple extra measures because of the design of this particular chair and the fact that it only has a spreader in the middle here. Some chairs have rungs in the front and the back, and these steps wouldn't be necessary. But the way this is set up, if I put pressure on that clamp, it's just going to pull the legs together, and then something will snap. So to prevent that, I'll take a couple measures here so that that extreme clamp pressure does what it does and doesn't self-destruct the chair in the process. To prevent clamp pressure from damaging the front of the chair, I just made a simple spreader to drop down in between the legs here, which will prevent those legs from coming together this way, and the clamp pressure will be applied this way to tighten up those sides. It's a little different on the back of the chair because these legs have a tilt this way, there's an angle, and I want those little plastic pads to conform to the angle of the leg and not just break the pad. So I made a couple little 10-degree wedges here. I'm slipping those in. And those will account for the angle of the leg And then I just add a stretcher similar to the front here to keep these legs from pulling together that way. And now with those extra measures in place, I can torque down on the band clamp and apply equal pressure to all 6 joints in this lower framework with one clamp and one setup all at the same time. And that's what I call a next level approach to clamping up this wobbly old chair to stabilize the joints. Because with just 2 clamps here, the chair is solid on the work surface, all the joints are just as tight as can be, and I can advance to the CA stabilization process with just the one setup at one time. I can position the chair any way it needs to be positioned for applying that CA so it flows into the joints nice, which will streamline the overall stabilization process to a good degree. Plus, these clamps have the dangly thing going on too, and that's a plus. Since you've already seen the CA stabilization process up close, Chip volunteered to come by and use it on this second chair. So I can take a couple minutes to tell you that the 2 heirloom chairs getting a new lease on life in this video are on loan from Love Inc., a local branch of a national nonprofit organization. The Rise Furniture Decor program at Love Inc. allows volunteers to earn sweat equity by refurbishing used furniture like these old chairs that's for sale at the store. John Leitenberg, who runs the local Love Inc. outreach, told me, quote, "More important than what we do is how we do it." This hands-on versus handout approach is more than transactional, it's transformational for those volunteers who participate. Personally, I think it's more than fitting that restoring old furniture like this helps volunteers restore their lives by building confidence and self-worth in the process. In addition to this video, I'll be doing a hands-on clinic at the Love Inc. outreach shop to teach volunteers how to use this CA stabilization process so they can do a lot more of the good work they're already doing for the outreach and for the community. I'll also include a link to the Love Inc. website so viewers can learn more about their amazing work and volunteer or participate if they're so inclined. Well, that should do it, and perfect timing once again. Now you can return these 2 chairs to Love Inc. once the CA cures and the band clamps are removed, while I have a talk with Wardrobe to sort out the t-shirt dilemma once and for all. Well, that sounds great, and thanks, Chip, for donating your time to Love Inc. on this project. That's really a great gift that just keeps on giving. See you later. See you later. Per Chip's suggestion, I let the CA glue cure in this chair for quite a few hours so that now that I can remove these band clamps. And as you saw earlier, deploying these band clamps can be kind of unwieldy, so it's no surprise that returning them to their wieldy state can be a bit tricky. But it's no big deal. I'll start with the lower clamp here, take a little of the pressure off with the screw, and then turn the crank handle so that I can just pull that band through. Got to manage the little crank handle on the case, like that. Let the clamp comes off and all the temporary bracing and shims come right out. And I might as well get both of these done while I'm at it. Same deal. Unscrew the handle, release the lever, pull out a little extra band and drop the clamp. And that is one solid chair. And the whole glue up process went next level well by using these band clamps. So let me move the camera and show you how to make these clamps wieldy once again. There's a link here to the in-depth Merrill band clamp review video I did some time ago, but for here and now, the mainest thing to understand is that the band doesn't rewind into the housing like a tape measure, but rather gets wound up into the housing using this little crank handle. To wieldify a clamp, I start by pulling the excess band through the clamp handle to corral the corner pieces. Then hold on tight to the crank and crank until the whole band is inside the housing. Once it's all wound up, I quickly and completely release the crank handle so it doesn't thrash my knuckles as the clock spring band releases wound up tension inside the housing. Once the clamps are all rewound and wieldy, I hang them on a special square peg hanger that keeps them out of the way, but handy for the next time I need next level clamping capability. I'll finish up by adding a couple comments about cleanup here. Now the CA glue runs into the joints. You've seen it run down when the clamps are in the way, or you just don't see it. You can get some glue on these surfaces. And there's a couple ways to clean that up. The first one is to use a sharp chisel to scrape away that glue, and it's pretty brittle and it pops off of there, especially if there's a finish on the chair like this. And I'll show you a close-up in a second, but I don't want to cut to that without mentioning that Starbond makes a debonder. It's kind of a thick viscosity. It's almost like a gel, and it comes in this little bottle with a brush, some of it dripping down there. And you can use that for cleaning up your fingers, for tools, for benches and stuff like that. And it'll also soften the CA glue on wood, but it could kind of tend to soak in. But keep that on hand and put it on your hands if you get your fingers stuck together somewhere in the process. But that's a great cleanup product for general use. But let me show you quick how nicely a chisel works to remove that CA from varnish. With this camera angle, you can see the reflection of light off of this streak of CA that ran down on this leg while the clamps were in place, but I'm just using a sharp chisel, emphasis on the word sharp, and you can see that that stuff just flakes right off there. Easy peasy. There's another streak on this back leg here, same difference, it just pops right off of there. And it is affecting the finish a little bit, which is to be expected. If you're doing a super critical piece, you could put some masking tape on there to kind of prevent this in the end. But that just works super nice. It wouldn't come off that easy if that wood was raw or sanded. I'll show you one more spot here where this side piece meets the back. There's a little bit of CA on the surface. That pops right off there like before. I'm being careful not to scrape the wood, only the CA. And then there's kind of a buildup of glue in this corner. And I'm just going to slide this chisel like that. And you can see how that glue just pops out of there. And the reason it's not sticking is because this is old, what I would call dirty varnish. It's probably been waxed and stuff over the years. So it just releases that CA glue. If I wanted the CA to stick, I could have scraped or sanded that in the first place. But that old varnish kind of acts like, almost like masking tape in a situation like this, and makes cleanup pretty easy. And there you have it. Gel debonder and a sharp scraper for cleanup, which completes the CA glue stabilization process of another fine old chair. Well, I sure didn't expect to produce a video over an hour long just to show you a simple way to stabilize wobbly old furniture any more than you expected to watch one. But hopefully, my focus on the topic will mean more truly worthy pieces of heirloom furniture will live longer, more useful lives for future generations. And now, since my work here is done, I'll say, as always and until next time, thanks for watching. What is up with the shirt? Wardrobe? Wardrobe? Well, hey guys, thanks for sticking around to the end of the end of the end of this video. And it's a bit ironic because this is actually the end of the beginning. I just finished shooting the introduction sequence to this video, and because the video is about fixing loose joinery and not broken parts, I didn't want to include this little bit of the video itself, but I decided to tack it onto the end just as an extra tidbit for furniture restoration, because a broken part on a wobbly chair is a high likelihood, and as such it's a topic for a whole video in itself. But because there was just one break on both of these chairs, it's a simple clean fracture, I wanted to show you how I fix stuff like this, and I'm going to fix this before I actually fix the wobbly part on both chairs in the main body of the video. So what I've got to deal with here is a broken stretcher on the bottom. This front leg wobbles, and I want to fix that before I do the other repairs. So let me bring the camera in close and show you how I go about a simple repair like this. Okay, well here's a closer shot of the break. It's a clean break across this little piece. It's about 5/8 by 1.25 inches. And it just cracked along the grain line, probably when somebody stepped on it there. You can see what this looks like. And in hindsight, probably 100 years after the fact, I can say that this was a bad choice of grain orientation for this piece because there's a stress point there, and this weak cross grain made this susceptible to this kind of break. So the bad news is that it broke. The good news is that it's a nice clean break and nobody's tried to fix it before. So I'm very confident in the results I'll get with this repair. All right, I repositioned the camera so you can see right down into the fracture here. It's nice and clean. There's no chips or splinters in there, and there's no glue from previous attempts. If any of that stuff existed, I got to get it all cleaned out so that it comes back together perfectly when it's clamped. And in this situation, I'm going to use an unusual clamp, which is this vice grip C-clamp with these big pads on here. This is kind of like from the world of bodywork, but this can work excellent on woodworking as well because I can get instant clamp pressure and a lot of it focused. And you can see there, just by snapping that vice grip in there, everything is just perfect on the way this fits. So that's the clamp of choice for this little project here. And to prevent the metal from staining things, I'm using Scotch packing tape. And I just cut a couple little pads to cover the jaws on this. That'll keep any rusting or contamination from metal and the Titebond 3 glue from staining the wood. So that's the clamp. The joint's clean, ready to go. I have dry fit it, so that's all good. And I'm just going to use a simple fill and pump method to get the glue down in there. I'm using Titebond 3 glue, this stuff right here. I just put a generous dose down in that fracture and then kind of pump it. Pushing it in there with my finger, making it go everywhere it needs to go and probably some places it doesn't want to go. But that pumping action forces the glue way down into the finer crevices or reaches of that joint. And I can just tell by when it's squeezing out. I know that it's full, but I keep pushing it in there. Way down in there, I use a little bit more over here. There's a part of this fracture that you can't see in the camera over here, and I want to make sure that's cleaned up, but everything is taken glue now, so that's a really good sign. I break tradition here, and I don't use sawdust to clean up wet glue on a job like this because I don't want any sawdust down in that joint. I'm just going to kind of wipe this off to get back down to the original varnish of the piece. I'll be able to do a little bit of cleanup when it's dry, but for right now, I'm just getting the bulk of it off of here. And I know that there's still, the joint is completely full because it squeezes out when I put this in place. And I'm using Titebond for this because ultimately on a repair like this, Titebond is just stronger. It's not as brittle as CA glue. In a pinch, I could use Starbond medium CA glue in here and this joint would hold. But because of the stress on it and the less than ideal orientation of the grain in this piece, I'm going with everything I got, which is Titebond 3. I could use epoxy in this, but the Titebond 3 is less of a mess. It's quicker and it's as strong as it needs to be. If this piece breaks again, it'll break somewhere other than my glue joint. But with all that said, I'm confident in everything. Now you can see what happens when I put this vice grip on here. I'm going to put a little torque on it and clamp it down. So I'm really happy with that. I'm going to put another clamp on it this direction just because. And I like that. The way this broke and the way it came together, the wood fibers are stretched a little bit. And by adding this clamp to the top, I'm forcing those fibers back together this direction. And so this clamp, in addition to that one, gives me the best fit of the fibers and the original length and configuration of this piece. And clean up some of this glue under here just to help clean up later. And ironically, I actually could use a little bit of water on that cloth here to help clean that up because the wood has a finish on it and it won't cause the glue to soak in. But as it is, that's what I want this repair to look like. So I can just leave it be, and the way the video shoot's going, I can leave this overnight to make sure I get a real good permanent set on that Titebond 3 glue for this repair. All right, well, I can wrap up the end at that. Thanks for sticking around and watching. I'm going to go back to the end of the beginning and do the stabilization of this chair after this glue sets and this comes out of the clamps. So thank you guys for sticking around to the end of the end, and I hope those tips will guide you in some repairs, whether it's old furniture or not, because the technique that I just showed here is pretty classic for a simple break in a piece of wood. And needless to say, it only covers one of an infinite number of different break scenarios, but these are steps I use all the time to fix breaks, and hopefully it'll benefit you by adding it to your skill set for projects going forward. So we'll catch up with you at the beginning and the end of the beginning of the end of the end of the beginning when I begin or before I end the next Level Carpentry video on YouTube. See ya.